While fighting game media hasn't always been well regarded, they continue to be made, and in the midst of some absolute stinkers, we do have a few really great adaptations of games in other media. Hi guys, welcome to part 2 of our Street Fighter and Other Media retrospective. So last time around, we talked about the movies, both animated and live action, and the short films that have been done around the Street Fighter franchise. To sum it up, we got a few animated Street Fighter films which were decent, if not particularly great, but they at least tried to add something to the Street Fighter lore. But then came along the infamous 1994 adaptation that falls firmly into the so bad it's good category of movies. And of course, as much as we'd all like to forget it, we will forever be stuck with the abomination that was the Street Fighter Legend of Chun-Li movie. In the midst of all this, however, we also got some really great short films that were actually made by fans, like the supremely underrated Balrog Behind the Glory and the Matador movie, which followed Boxer and Claw respectively. Today, however, we'll be focusing on the series and comics that have spawned from the Street Fighter games. Now, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it for you friends, like with the movies in the last video, we kinda got a mixed bag here, as most of the series tried to do their own thing and generally only followed the Street Fighter story loosely at best. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. After all, Street Fighter is not really known for their storytelling. So, where do we start? I guess we should go chronologically, which means there's only one feasible starting point, which is Street Fighter 2V. Also known as Street Fighter 2 Voyage, this was an animated series that aired in Japan in 1995, but it also produced 2 dub versions, one of which was marketed in North America in 1996 and the other was sold in the UK market in 1997. The plot of the show followed Ryu and Ken as they traveled the world in a bid to become the strongest fighters. The show was directed by Gyasburo Sugi, who was also at the helm of Street Fighter 2, the animated movie, which we've discussed previously. The core of the series was loosely based on Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which had been released in 1994. The show also involved Takashi Nishiyama, who was instrumental in the creation of Street Fighter's story. Alright, so technically speaking, this can be considered an anime, but considering that anime can broadly be categorized as a series, that's why it's being treated here. As we mentioned earlier, SF2V only loosely followed the story of the game, and there were various differences between the characters as we know them and how they were portrayed in the series. The most obvious difference was in the character of Ryu. Viewers very quickly noticed that Ryu's design in this anime is weird and more like an SNK protagonist than Capcom's most popular character. He's without his iconic headband, and it does not feature in any of the 29 episodes this show has. Also, Ryu's spiky hair is uncharacteristic along with his personality, which was a departure from his more stoic nature. Here, he was a simple-minded kid who showed a lot of enthusiasm and was always on the hunt for a good challenge. There is also a hint of impulsiveness, which is something more akin to what Ken would do. Ryu was not the only one to see a different design and even backstory, as characters like Chun-Li looked a little different. From a story perspective, we saw a few huge differences from the game, like the fact that here Vega is not affiliated with Shadaloo at all, but is simply a bullfighter with a love of all things beautiful. Also, Balrog was a dirty Interpol agent who was in league with Bison, while Chun-Li's father, who has barely been seen in the Street Fighter lore and generally just serves as motivation and fuel for Chun-Li's character, was a prominent player in the show. His name is Dodai, and he's one of the top men in Interpol. He also rather nicely doesn't die this time, which is a really nice change from what we've come to expect from a Chun-Li storyline. But still, there were even more changes, including Sagat, who did not have an eye patch in the show. There were actually some really interesting choices in the show, like how they kept Fei Long's story as a Johnny Cage-like movie star, but now he has a pompadour and is a student of Dodai, or how Dhalsim doesn't have his signature skull necklace. Let's also not forget to add Charlie Nash. Yeah, him. You remember Charlie Nash? Well, in this show, he looked like this. If you don't even recognize who that is, don't worry, cause neither did I. But there was a reasonable explanation for this. Street Fighter 2V was released in 1994, and Street Fighter Alpha, which was Nash's first appearance in the game, would come out a year later. So it would seem that at this time his design was not quite ready yet or something like that. But imagine if this was the Nash we ended up with. Who knows, maybe they'd make it work. Anyway, all in all, Street Fighter 2V was a good time, and it's certainly one of the better adaptations of Street Fighter, and once you get past the liberties taken with the story, you'll find a nice Street Fighter tale that tried to do something fun with the IP. Also, did I mention that Akuma just randomly appeared in like 11 episodes without really doing anything? I mean, I know you can't use every character, but with so many cameos, you'd think he'd be brought into the story a little bit, but it never happens and it feels a bit weird. However, considering how the story has been meddled with, it would have been interesting to see what they would do with Akuma's story. Would they have made him Ryu's father? Or maybe some vengeful former student of Goken? I know, but we can dream, right? Oh, and finally, I promise this time, T-Hawk appeared in the opening credits but was not in the show in any capacity. Some people say this suggests that there was a season 2 on the cards and for some reason it just never came to fruition. Become DashFight supporter on Patreon. Get early access to the DashFight guides. Click the link in the description. Instead, we got the second series we're going to be talking about, and that is Street Fighter the Animated Series. The Street Fighter animated series aired between 1995 and 1997, with two 13-episode seasons to make a total of 26 episodes. So the storyline followed Guile and many of the other characters from the Street Fighter universe as they fought against the forces of Shadowloo, which was a criminal organization headed by Bison. Like most of the cartoons from the 90s, Street Fighter had a Transformers-esque or G.I. Joe aesthetic, which was really popular back in the day, and most of the episodes were self-contained, meaning there were very few arcs. The show stayed mostly true to Street Fighter lore, but also took some elements from the 1994 Street Fighter movie that starred Van Damme. The most prominent of these loans was having Guile as the main protagonist of the show, and he led a team of Street Fighters to fight against Bison. So, the Street Fighters, which consisted of Ryu, Ken, E Honda, Chun-Li, and Cammy were the good guys, and were described as a team of crime fighters. Which, I mean, okay, just look at the opening.
And together they will triumph against the forces of evil. Street Fighter!
Anyway, the story had some differences from the game, like the difference in occupation for Chun-Li and the fact that somehow E Honda is a tech whiz. The show was not as well regarded as Street Fighter 2V, and after its 2-season run, it ended without much fanfare. It did spawn some interesting moments like the yes yes meme here, which was just funny to watch. It also featured characters from other games like Final Fight. In episode 25, Guy, Cody, and Hagar all appear in the cartoon as they teamed up with the Street Fighters to battle the Mad Gear Gang. There was even a crossover event from episode 22 that involved other titles on the USA Action Extreme Team block, including Mortal Kombat, Defenders of the Realm, Savage Dragon, and Wing Commander Academy, although none of the characters actually got to meet each other, but were instead connected by a common event. So there you have it. If you've been dreaming of a Street Fighter Mortal Kombat crossover, here you go. You're welcome. Looking back with the clarity of hindsight, Street Fighter the Animated Series was a fun time for kids, but ultimately it just fell short as a good adaptation for any true fan, as there's just too much that doesn't really tally with people's understanding of the game. If you ask me, in my totally unbiased opinion, the best content around games are always made by passionate fans, and when such passionate fans are given the right resources and are allowed to follow their visions, we get Street Fighter Assassin's Fist. I'm not exaggerating to say that of all the adaptations for such a beloved franchise as Street Fighter, Assassin's Fist will perhaps be remembered as the best one. Now, in case you're unfamiliar, Assassin's Fist was a 12-episode English TV and web series that followed Ken and Ryu as they trained with their master, Goken, and unraveled the secrets of his past. Assassin's Fist was spearheaded by Joey Anshaw and Christian Howard, who played Akuma and Ken respectively, and as fans of the game, they put in a lot of heart, which made the show a great success. Perhaps just pissed off at the train wreck that was Street Fighter The Legend of Chun-Li, Ansah and Howard got together and wrote a short film featuring Ryu and Ken, which was called Street Fighter Legacy. The film went on to be released on YouTube in 2010 and received such positive reviews that the filmmakers had the confidence to move forward with something more fleshed out and concrete. Street Fighter Legacy was only about 4 minutes long and featured a fight between Ryu and Ken. The fight was beautifully choreographed and the use of special moves was well done too. The film starred John Fu as Ryu and Christian Howard, who would reprise his role later as Ken. Then, Capcom even gave the series its blessing, stating at the 2012 San Diego Comic-Con that the project had been given a go-ahead. The producers initially planned to make a series that would follow the lore of Street Fighter II World Warrior, but decided to put that on ice and use it for a bigger budget sequel. Instead, they opted to tell a more intimate story that followed the main protagonists of the game and helped give their characters deeper meaning. From the setting and the way the story was told, you can clearly see the influence of the 2005 movie Street Fighter Alpha Generations, with the addition of Gouken, Gouki, Gotetsu, and Sayaka. Okay, so we're gonna be talking a little bit about the story, so consider this your official spoiler warning. If you want to watch Assassin's Fist, you can find it easily on YouTube, then come back. Alright, everyone still here? You're sure you don't mind the spoilers, because I already warned you, I'm not going to get any hate down in the comments, okay? Okay, here we go. The story starts with Gouken teaching Ken and Ryu the art of Ansatsuken. But Ken is getting impatient as he wants to learn something cool. He considers leaving the dojo to go back home to America, but Ryu is able to convince him to give it some more time. Later on, Gouken has them meet him at his childhood dojo, and there he teaches them the primary moves of Ansatsuken. While there, Ken discovers a room and some secret arts of Ansatsuken stored in some writings. When he starts lagging in training, he tries what he learned from the paintings, which turns out to be Satsui no Hado, a style of Ansatsuken practiced by Akuma, who is called Gouki in the series. Gouken dissuades Ken from using this style, and we get a peek into Gouken's past, where he and his brother, Gouki, orphans who lost their parents, were being taught by Ansatsuken master Gotetsu. It soon became clear, however, that Gouki was power-hungry and would stop at nothing to obtain the powerful Satsui no Hado. It's even got a love triangle between Gouken, Gouki, and Sayaka. One of the most impressive things about Street Fighter Assassin's Fist was its ability to seamlessly tell two tales while keeping audience engagement high. So Gouki would leave the dojo to find his own path and would later return to challenge Gotetsu in combat. That's when we find out the horrifying truth about Ansatsuken. Only one person can be its master at a time, which means that by teaching Gouki and Gouken, Gotetsu was inadvertently pitting the brothers against each other. This is what truly drives Gouki away, and after years of training, he came back to kill Gotetsu and claim the title of the Ansatsuken master. Gouki's actions, however, bring nothing but grief to Sayaka and Gouken, with the former even going so far as to run away from Gouken. Now, there are some rumors that Sayaka could be Ryu's mother, but it's not canon and there's not really any evidence or basis for it anyway. Okay, so back in the present timeline, we find that Ryu, who we saw through the help of flashbacks, endured a difficult childhood, is now being influenced by the power of Satsui no Hado. He and Ken approach the end of their training with Gouken, and they have one final test, a test that pits them against each other in a fight. Ken eventually wins, but Ryu is taken over by Satsui no Hado. Ken is only able to knock him out with a fiery dragon punch. Ryu recovers, and it's time for the duo to leave the dojo and embark on their warrior's journey. However, all the shenanigans of the dojo has attracted Gouki, who has now fully embraced the dark side. The series ends with Gouki challenging Gouken to fight to the death. It seems these Street Fighter movies have a thing for ending on cliffhangers. There is a post-credit scene that shows Ken and Ryu arriving in the United States, where we expect that their adventure would continue. The movie was shot primarily in Bulgaria, and the use of Japanese in the storytelling was an added bonus that enhanced the immersiveness of the experience. As for the cast, well, Christian Howard and Joey Ansah returned as Ken and Akuma, while John Fu was replaced as Ryu by Mike Mo. Akira Koiyama played Gouken, and Togu Igawa played Gotetsu. Korean actress Hyun Lee played Sayaka, and we even got a guest appearance by the legendary Yoshinori Ono, who played a fight promoter in the show. Filming started in April 2013 and was wrapped up in August of the same year, and it was released via Machinima on YouTube in May 2014. This was followed by releases by Funimation and several other production companies in various regions. The show was wildly successful and was praised for great acting, very decent production quality, and the story which stayed true to Street Fighter. Assassin's Fist was heartwarming in its portrayal of Ken and Ryu and their friendship/rivalry, which has always been the driving force for their story, and the care taken to really flesh out Gouken and Gouki's story brought so much to the game's lore. The series was made on a meager $2.5 million budget, but they were able to create some real magic with even just that. There is one scene in particular that requires some talking about, and for me it was the highest point of the entire show. This was the fight scene between Goki and Gotetsu. So in the scene, Gotetsu attempts to throw a Metsu Hadoken, and using the power of the Raging Demon, Goki counters, finishing off the fight and claiming victory. Okay, sure, it wasn't the greatest piece of special effects we've ever seen, but the use of the Raging Demon sound effect, the movement of Goki, and the clear amount of work and love given to that scene deserves an honorable mention. Street Fighter Assassin's Fist would be followed by Street Fighter Resurrection. Initially, the showrunners wanted something that followed the Street Fighter II storyline, which would have been called Street Fighter World Warrior. The new story would have continued to follow Ryu and Ken and would have introduced Guile, Chun-Li, Bison, and some of the other characters we all know and love, but it was not meant to be. Joey Ansah, who had been the creative head behind Assassin's Fist, wrote an open letter to fans in 2020 confiding in them about some of the troubles the proposed sequel faced. He explained that the massive budget, working with big studios who can be a hassle to partner with, especially if you want to keep a story a certain way, and only a small window before the rights obtained from Capcom would elapse, all contributed to the failure to produce a sequel. Instead, in 2016, we got Resurrection, which took place 10 years after Assassin's Fist and featured Nash and DiCaprio. There were only 4 episodes and it was made with Street Fighter V's upcoming release in mind. Sadly, there was no Street Fighter World Warrior, and while all hope is not lost that the series could still come to the small screen, it's looking increasingly unlikely. So, that about does it for the Street Fighter series. Now, let's talk about the very weird and wild world of Street Fighter comics. Okay, so maybe I was being a little bit dramatic back there. So there have been several Street Fighter comics, and many of them have been pretty cool. There is of course the Udon comics that have generally been Capcom's go-to guys for Street Fighter comics. Udon has done a number of series on Street Fighter, many of which closely followed the lore with very few variations. The first set of Street Fighter comics were released between 2003 and 2005, and there were 13 issues. The plot of the comics follows Ryu, who upon discovering his master, Goken, dead in his dojo, goes to the United States to find Ken and tell him the tragic news while also looking for the killer. Meanwhile, Guile and Chun-Li are on the hunt to capture Bison for what he did to them. For Guile, it was the death of Charlie, and for Chun-Li, it was the murder of her father. The Udon comics had some of the most talented artists working on it, including Alvin Lee, Edwin Huang, and Arnold Sang. It was followed by Street Fighter II and later Street Fighter II Turbo, which followed the World Warrior storyline where Ryu and the rest of the Street Fighter cast compete in a fighting tournament with the finalists pitted against Bison. Then came Street Fighter IV, which followed the story after Bison's apparent demise and went to put some meat on the bones of the SIN storyline and how Seth became what it did. We also got some new characters, including Sea Viper and Abel. Next was Super Street Fighter and finally Street Fighter Unlimited. However, scattered throughout the previous releases were some special editions which helped in understanding the story further. They were called the Street Fighter Legends, and 4 issues were released in total, each focusing on a different female character. The first one was about Sakura and how she got to meet Armika and grow stronger after parting with Ryu. The second was about Chun-Li, the third, Ibuki, and finally Cammy. These issues were still tied to the main storyline and could be read with the main narrative to gain a deeper knowledge of the lore. There wasn't any Street Fighter V comic, but we will be getting one for Street Fighter VI, as Udon announced in a tweet from November 2022, which they say will heavily feature Luke and will be an indicator of where the Street Fighter lore is headed next. The Udon Street Fighter comics are always a great resource for story and great art. But, unfortunately, they're not the only Street Fighter comic that was ever made. There was another one made back in 1993 that was such a disaster that it was cancelled after only 3 issues. I am of course talking about the crazy, insane ridiculousness that was the Street Fighter Malibu comics. So in case you're unaware, Malibu Comics was an American company founded in 1986 that made comics most notably about their Ultraverse superheroes. So in the early 90s, they somehow got their hands on the rights to Street Fighter and they made a comic that was supposed to complement the SF2 game, which had come out in 1991. There was, however, a bit of a problem in that the Malibu comics were terrible, but you could understand the difficulty for them as Street Fighter did not have much of a story to it at this point. Okay, so you want to know what happened in the comics? Well, it starts off with the iconic Ryu vs. Sagat fight, and Ryu unleashes his Shoryuken, scarring Sagat. However, it turns out that this isn't happening live, and Sagat is watching it on a screen, which he then angrily destroys and discards before getting into a needless fight with Balrog, who seems to be taunting him. So then Bison comes in and berates the two men and tells them how they must destroy Ryu. Why? Just because. Eventually, they decide to use Ken to get to Ryu, and so they attack Ken while he's with Chun-Li. So they fight, and get this, Sagat kills Ken and then sends his scalp to Ryu. Child-friendly, this comic was not. Edgy? Definitely. The entire cast of Street Fighter mourns Ken's death, with the news affecting different characters in different ways. But at this point, Capcom were done with Malibu Comics and asked that they stop production, so we only got the 3 issues. There's a lot we could say about the Malibu Street Fighter comics, but we'll keep it to these 2. The art was bad and the story was unnecessarily edgy. In all fairness, however, this could be a symptom of the times, as the 90s were the era where we got really bloody and edgy comics. But looking back at it now, I think it's safe to say that it has not aged that well. So what else is there to talk about? There was a Street Fighter 3 comic from Brazil, and a bunch of crossovers, including one with SNK characters and even one with Mega Man and Sonic. As for mangas, Street Fighter had a couple. By far the most popular though was Masahiko Nakahira's series, which consisted of Street Fighter Alpha, Street Fighter Sakura Gambaru in 1997, Street Fighter 3 Ryu Final, and Super Street Fighter 2 Kami. The Street Fighter stories focused on Ryu and his battle with his dark side, while Sakura Gambaru and Kami focused on the titular heroes. Nakahira's mangas were beautiful and told a great story, and we got some incredible fight scenes like this one from Ryu and Akuma's showdown. Nakahira's stories were actually pretty important, as they were instrumental in introducing some characters into the mainline Street Fighter games. For instance, Karen first appeared in Sakura Gambaru, and Evil Ryu was first featured in Street Fighter Alpha. There was another manga made by Masaomi Kanzaki called Street Fighter 2, which ran between 1993 and 1994. Now again, as discussed with the Malibu comics, the lack of Street Fighter lore at that time forced the creators to go in an other way. For Kanzaki, this meant creating an island called Shad, which had been abandoned and now taken over by Bison, who instituted illegal fighting tournaments. This was the first comic that introduced Gouken as a visible character, which was great to see. The art here is also pretty good, and there were 2 glorious volumes. There were actually 3 volumes, but the third one suffered a drop in quality and we got another generic clone story. Man, honestly, it is impossible to highlight each and every single piece of Street Fighter media out there, but I think we've done our best to shine a light on the most important ones at least. So, now it's your turn. Let us know down below, what's your favorite piece of Street Fighter media and what do you want us to cover in the future? And while you're down there, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video, and we'll see you in the next one.